practice. We are here to take up H697, and I think our first witness is former Senator and now Representative Bongartz. If you'd introduce yourself for the record.
For the record, Seth Bongartz, Representative Seth Bongartz, I'm a member of the House Committee on Natural Resources, Fish and Wildlife, and I was the reporter of this bill on the House floor. So, H697. So, just as a starting point, I'll do a mini version of what I said on the floor. Current use, you probably all know this all very well, but anyway, it's a brilliant construct. It has keeps forest land intact. The land as part of the program, both acres in the land are well managed, and our forest economy generates $2.1 billion a year in Vermont. And so I think the starting point is to put it, well, just what else to put it, that this bill and anything that we've done has absolutely zero criticism of the current use program as it's been administered, and its work is brilliant. But when constructed back in the early 70s by Henry Carson and others, my chair, by the way, when I was on the Natural Resources Committee 40 years ago, Henry Carson was the architect of this. But when constructed, nobody was thinking about biodiversity or climate change. So this is a bill about incorporating sort of what we've learned since the bill was, back in those days, we were thinking about wildlife, but we weren't thinking about biodiversity. We certainly weren't thinking about climate change. So the idea here, which I'll get to in a minute, is to produce a reserve category, another category within the current use program. But as a starting point, just as put a background for all of you, 80% of Vermont's forest land is privately owned. So if we're going to do something about this, that's the place it's going to happen. 70% of land currently eligible for the current use program is enrolled. And that's about 2 million acres.
What was that percentage again?
70%. So 80% of Vermont's forest land is privately owned, and of the land, forest land eligible for the current use program, about 70% is already in. That translates to about 2 million acres enrolled in the program. So in the meantime, getting back to the initial point about biodiversity and climate change, the Vermont Conservation Design, and I know you're all very familiar with the Vermont Conservation Design, put together by a combination by the Fish and Wildlife Department and for Parks and Recreation, is looking to achieve, or has the stated goal of returning 9% of Vermont's forests to old growth condition. We have less than 1% in that status now, or something like 1%. And so we have, call it an 8% gap to make up. So the question is, how do we do that? And so within the current use program now, again, I think I'm talking to people who already understand this well. There's a category called ESTA, ecologically significant treatment areas, that allow bits of a parcel to be a higher level of protection because, for instance, there are riparian areas, wetlands, steep slopes, those kinds of things. So that's kind of the starting point. This was introduced by the department, I don't know, I forget how many years ago, but as the program had aged along, the notion of ESTAs was introduced. But the program as currently constructed cannot support efforts to achieve full growth forest. That is something else needs to happen within that. So we asked the commissioner last April or May or something like that, whether he and his department, his team, would explore for us the way that we might be able to utilize the program, the current use program, to move toward achievement of our goal of 9% old growth forest. The commissioner, well, who's here can say this for himself, but I said it's for the board, so I'll say it here. Obviously, because it came out of his department, supported the goal of getting to 9%, but urged us to be very cautious, take a go slow approach, because we're dealing with what is already a careful construct, well managed for us within the program for which the way it was designed, and we wanted to be able to go slow approach to make sure that we do this carefully. And so he and his team spent the spring, summer, and into the fall to develop a process. And he delivered to my committee, or me and the chair of the committee, and the name of the report was Conditions for a Reserved Forest Land Subcategory in Vermont's Use Value Appraisal Program.
Say it again.
You don't need to memorize it, actually. So he delivered a report on October 15th of 21. And the way that works is going back to the Estes for a minute, using Estes as kind of the underlying criteria, is to obviously, there were some in the community, the larger community, and the community of current views people who said anybody who wants to should be able to enroll their parcel in a program that would allow their land to go back to old growth condition. That would mean we would open it up for everybody who wouldn't quite know how many would go in, what the confines might be, how much that might change the existing program in a way that we might not want to change it. And so what, and obviously there are those who oppose doing anything, by the way, so those are the spectrums. So where the report ended up, and the reason I'm talking about the report is it's actually encompassed by title within the bill as a starting point for this, is that land parcels that have 30% of ESTA characteristics, those things like riparian areas, wetlands, steep slopes. I'm sure I'm leaving a couple of things out, the commissioner will fill in for that. 30%, which is a relatively high percentage of land, could then the entire parcel could go into this category called forest reserve category, which is really a way to begin to achieve full growth. And the reason for it being bigger than just the little slices of ESTA-like lands is that biodiversity only works in areas large enough for biodiversity to take place. It can't just be little kind of corridors. You're not achieving real biodiversity there. So, so to get to the numbers, welcome back.
Thank you. Sorry to be absent.
I knew we were. So to get to the numbers, remember that we have 2 million acres of the land eligible for current use. We have 70% is enrolled. That translates to about 2,000 acres now. Under the system set up or suggested by the department, one way that we might go forward with this, 860,000 acres of land would be potentially eligible for this program, the reserve program category. Of those 860, 630,000 are already in the program. So those are 630,000 acres that could conceivably switch to be in this category. And 230,000 acres of that 30% of eligible land, current use land that's not enrolled currently, could conceivably come into the program. So it's about call it 2 to 1, for the sake of getting the discussion started. And could come in. And so that's actually the shortest version of how the program works. The idea is, again, to head toward the goal of the 9% articulated in the Vermont conservation design. The current use program is the vehicle we have. That's where all the land is. And so what we're doing with this is doing it carefully, surgically, and we have people again unhappy with on kind of both sides of this. A lot of people, we got a lot of, some people saying I should be able to do this too. And we have, of course, some don't want to go this direction at all, but we try to do it in a way that, so there are a couple of reports that come along, by the way. One is that by December 31st of this year, the department would give the the committees, and actually the Ways and Means and Agriculture, I forget the number of committees, would get a report on exactly how the enrollment would work, what the standards would be. And that would actually give, theoretically, the committees time to adjust if they wanted to, because the enrollment doesn't begin until July 1 of 23, next year, yeah, 23. So it was staggered for that reason. We referenced in the bill the report, which lays out the categories that I sort of talked about it, but then the standards need to be refined. So that would happen between now and December 31st. Reports to the legislature with exactitude about how that would work. The legislature would theoretically have time to either just do nothing because, yeah, that's good to get above, or make some adjustment, and enrollment can start on July 1 of 23. There is then a second report, this one is for the Ways and Means Committee, that just sort of wants to take a look at the way that valuations take place between just within the whole program, and of course the valuations for how this will work. There's one topic that they might want to take a look at. I forget when that one's due. And then there's another report, the third report, which we had two in the bill originally. The first one I described, and then the third one is by December 31st of 25 from the department, a kind of a how's it going report. How many have been, what have been the reasons people who might have been moved that are into this category not done so, how many have, or why, or how, what's working well, what's not working well, and maybe some suggestions about changes that might not take place. We've had a few years of experience. So it's from our perspective, and I heard you talking about it this morning when I was in here with Chair Shelton and talking about the migratory, the way that Vermont is so important within the Northeast because of our continuity of forest blocks, forest land, and corridors, and why Vermont is so important as a corridor, biological corridor, and this sort of helps move it along. And by the way, the intent is also to, you don't want to have biodiversity happens differently at different elevations, different soil types, different everything. So the goal here, we could have said, only land above X way up, but then you wouldn't really be achieving what we're trying to achieve with this bill, which is to have a diversity of biodiversity at different elevations and different places in the state, so that because all of them are required for biodiversity, truly biodiversity. So that's, and of course, to say something else, I know you talked about, right? But the older the forest is, the more it is a carbon sink, carbon storage. And so all of those things lead us to urge you to support this bill.
Great bill. Thank you. You touched on it at the end. I was just going to say, if you could, since we're dealing with these back to back on purpose, if you could say how this work, how this complements the 30 by 30.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I hadn't thought about that. But obviously, I say obviously, but it does. You heard it shared this morning talking about the 3 levels of conservation, if you will, within the 30 by 30 and the 50 by 50. The existing current use program, which is a critical part of the Vermont's economy, critical to all kinds of things, would be largely the 3rd level of management, and that's all. That's every witness we had on that bill going to that talked about the need for to help this 30 by 30, 50, 50 by 50 be a mechanism for enhancing Vermont's working landscape and keeping Vermont's working landscape, part of what Vermont is. And then the category here, that would be the 9% of old growth forest that we're trying to achieve within the first category. So we need all of this, and they do go together. Thank you for that question, actually. They go together very well.
Any questions for Lieutenant Baumgart?
No, I think it's a really interesting idea.
My apologies for arriving during your testimony. Meeting with Chair Sheldon, Speaker Pro Tem about the map from here to the finish
I
line.
knew you would. I knew where you were.
Right. There are no questions. Thank you very much for coming back again. And thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks.
We will.
Thanks.
Mr. O'Grady, could you join us at the table and do Bill walk through with us? Thank you. Morning. And thank you for putting together that chart with all the water withdrawal data for other states. Everyone has that on their spot. We'll come back to having a discussion about that later, but I just want to make sure I said thank you and that committee members know that somewhere in their information on their desk is that sheet. Right. Back to you, Mr. O'Grady.
This is Michael Grady with the Office of Legislative Counsel. I'm going to repeat at the beginning for context some of the information that Representative Baumgart's already went through. Last year, the House Natural Resources Fish and Wildlife Committee was interested in looking at ways to allow landowners to enter the use value appraisal program in order to basically conserve that land for all the benefits that it provides, as Representative Baumgart just described to you. Currently, there is a way to do that. It's called conserved land, but it's fairly restrictive. You have to be a nonprofit organization that's holding the land under a conservation easement for the only purpose of conservation of the land. So that is fairly restrictive, and persons who own land and wanted to conserve it didn't want to be tied down by those restrictions. So the committee looked at a couple of different options and frankly ran into roadblocks here and there, and then asked the Commissioner of Forest, Parks and Recreation to look at the issue and report back to the General Assembly with a proposal for enrolling reserve forest land in Vermont's use value appraisal program. And the Commissioner and Keith drafted this report, which is very key to this bill and the enrollment of reserve forest land in use value. So I have to refer to that report a couple of times as I go through the bill. So when the committee—
Sorry, for people who are watching that report, I believe, is posted on our website. If not already, we'll make sure it is. Okay, thank you.
So the committee, they received the report in October. They reviewed it. They had a bill drafted, and it is what is in front of you. The one thing I want to note about use value appraisal bills, especially for forest land, is they're not incredibly detailed, because the model has always been to give the implementing agency, whether it's the Agency of Agriculture or PBR or the Department of Forests and Parks and Recreation, discretion to set the standards for enrollment. And that's what this bill does, but it does provide some context and some cabining for enrollment. So that's the background. So I'll start walking through the bill.
And, sorry, can you just say again, please, the restrictions around conserved land and why that's not a viable solution in mind of?
Sure. So you can actually find those requirements in the bill.
Okay.
It's on page 7. It has to be owned by an organization that is certified by the Commissioner of Taxes as a qualified organization as defined in 10 VSA 6301A, which means it's a nonprofit organization whose basically purpose is to conserve land. For at least 5 years preceding its certification, was determined by the Internal Revenue Service to qualify as a 501c3 organization, and that is not a private foundation, and is under an active conservation management and accord with standards established by the Commissioner of Forest, Parks and Recreation. That second part is not really the obstacle. The first part, you have to be a 501c3 for at least 5 years, and your sole purpose or one of your main purposes is certified by the Vermont Commissioner of Taxes is that you're an organization that is involved in the conservation of land. And then you got to hold it under a conservation easement, most likely underneath the requirements of that conservation organization.
Thank you.
So that's not very available.
Right.
To a lot of people, especially those people that want to conserve the land and retain ownership of the land.
Thanks.
So going forward, section 1 of the bill is a finding section. It's a fairly extensive finding section about the importance of forests, the importance of the UVA program, the importance of old forest, the fact that old growth forest, it doesn't have a way for the entire parcel, or has very limited way for the entire parcel to be enrolled in use value today, and that to achieve the ecological benefits that Representative Bongart's referenced, that old growth forest and this reserve forest land should be allowed to enroll in use value according to the conditions in the bill. But more specifically, you'll see on page 1, subdivision 1, there's a finding about the importance of Vermont's forests, how they're unique and irreplaceable, how they contribute to the conservation of wildlife, habitat, air, water, and soil resources, how they provide for a resource for the right to hunt and fish under the Constitution, how they mitigate the effects of climate change, and are a general benefit to the health and welfare of the citizens of the state. There's then a finding on privately owned forests, constitutes nearly 80% of Vermont's forests, provides the foundation for ecosystem services provided by Vermont's forests, provides the foundation of the forest economy in the state in total, and contributes more than 13,000 jobs and $2.1 billion annually to the economy. Then there's the finding on the use value appraisal program. How it encouraged and insisted in the maintenance of the working landscape and rural character of Vermont and protection of natural ecological systems for 40 years. How it currently is approximately 16,000 forest land parcels encompassing 2 million acres of enrolled forest land, has enrolled approximately 70% of the eligible forest land acres in the state and 55% of the eligible forest land parcels in the state. How it is critical for helping landowners keep forests as forests and ensuring its stewardship, but it has, with few exceptions, limited eligibility and enrollment for lands that are actively. It has limited eligibility and enrollment for those lands that are actively managed for timber and related forest products. And there's a finding on climate change, how it's creating threats to forests and their working functions and its ecological function. How climate change causes significant negative ecological and economic impacts. How it's best mitigated and adapted to through a diversity of forest management strategies and forest conditions in Vermont. And then there's a finding on old growth forest or old forest. It can provide unique contributions to biodiversity. It contributes and complements the climate resilience and adaptive capacity of the working landscape. It serves as an ecological benchmark in which to measure the active management of Vermont's forests. There are less than 1% of Vermont's forest land. We've heard Representative Bongard say that the goal is to have 9% in old growth characteristics. We effectively obtain through passive or restorative management or silviculture. And then there's the finding about preserving the working landscape and attainment of old forest conditions at a meaningful scale are compatible and complementary goals. However, forests that are managed passively for old forest or characteristics are only eligible for enrollment and use value under very limited circumstances, and is in the public interest of the persons of the state to increase opportunities within use value for attainment of old forest while ensuring that the program continues to effectively preserve the working landscape. So those are the findings. So then you go to the statutory purpose. There's 2 purpose sections in this chapter because about, I don't know, 10, 12 years ago, for every tax expenditure, there had to be a statutory purpose. So 3750 on page 4 is the tax expenditure statutory purpose. And adding to that is the provision that the purpose of UVA is to preserve the rural character of Vermont, preserve the working landscape, and protect the natural ecological systems and natural resources of the forest land of Vermont. Then you had the statement of purpose that existed in the program prior to the tax expenditure purpose being added, and it's more narrative. And what is being added is that the program is going to provide for natural ecological systems and services, including air and water quality, wildlife habitat and wildlife corridors, enhanced biodiversity, and forest health and integrity. In addition, on page 5, you'll see that the purpose will now be to assist in climate change adaptation and mitigation. So that is the purpose. Then you come to the definition, which is a very key aspect of this bill. This is basically the heart of the bill and how the program effectively will be implemented. Because managed forest land, as defined in the definitions in this section, is what is enrolled in use value, managed forest land. But there are different categories of managed forest land. Right now, we just went through the conserved land. That's part of managed forest land. There's also currently ecologically significant treatment areas, which Representative Baumgart's reference, which can also be enrolled as part of the parcel that's your managed forest land. Right now, in order to enroll managed forest land, you need 25 acres at a minimum, and at least 20 acres of any parcel has to be enrolled for productive use. But you can then have part of your parcel that is dedicated to ecologically significant treatment areas. It used to be that only 20% of your parcel could only be set aside for an ESTA, but that's not the case anymore. You can basically enroll an ESTA up to 20%, and then the commissioner has to approve anything over 20% over your parcel. You still need to have that 20 acres of managed forest land for productive timber use, but then it's up to the commissioner to approve how much of an ESTA is on that land. But the key aspect and the difference from an ESTA and reserve forest land can be the entire parcel. This is being proposed if it meets the conditions set forth in the report. Whereas an ESTA is only going to be a percentage, a part of a larger managed forest land parcel. So that's a key distinction to remember between what's in ESTA and what's reserve forest land. Reserve forest land, the entire parcel, and ESTA is just a component of a larger managed forest land parcel.
The 20 acres is a minimum of productive forest land out of 25. So So that's 20%, and but that's the absolute minimum. So if you're going to have an ESTA that's larger than just 5 acres on that 25 acre parcel, you have to have more acres than 25, or the commissioner's permission.
I think basically what you said is accurate, but you have to have a minimum of 20 acres on any parcel that's used for timber production, right? So it doesn't mean that you have to have 25 acres. You could have a 75 acre parcel and 20 acres of that need to be used for production, but maybe 10 of it is site 4, which is unproductive. And maybe maybe another 10 is open land. And then maybe the rest you want to enroll as ESTA. And so that would be more than 20% of the land, but the commissioner could approve the rest of that for an ESTA. So it's a 70 acre parcel, only 20 acres in productive forest land, and the other 50 is basically cut up into 3 different categories.
Okay, thank you.
So moving to the actual definitions, again, the key definition is managed forest land. It's on page 7 of H697. You will see that currently managed forest land means any land exclusive of any house site that is at least 25 acres in size and that is under active long-term forest management for the purpose of growing and harvesting repeated forest crops or attaining old forest values and functions. So it's not just about growing and harvesting, it's now growing and harvesting or attaining old forest values and functions. Then you will see on page 7, existing law that is being struck that such land may include eligible ecologically significant treatment areas that meet the minimum acceptable standards for forest management. That is basically how, under the current use structure and statutes, land gets enrolled or becomes eligible. The statute says, hey, this category is eligible, and the commissioner sets the minimum standards for eligibility. So that, with ESTAs, as you can see, is how ESTAs are currently enrolled according to the commissioner's minimum standards. But here on page 7, you'll see that it's now going to include ESTAs, eligible ecologically significant treatment areas, or reserve forest land, according to the commissioner's minimum standards. So that you've just authorized, if you pass this, that's how you authorize reserve forest land to be enrolled in use value. Doesn't look like a lot, but that's how you do it under use value. Then on page 8, you'll see definitions of what is an ecologically significant treatment area and what is reserve forest land. An ESTA means lands within a parcel of managed forest land that will be managed using protective or conservation management strategies and are not required to be managed for timber, including old forests. It includes state significant natural communities, rare, threatened, and endangered species, riparian areas, forested wetlands, and vernal pools. That's how you qualify for an ESTA.
Is this underlined because it's just been moved or something?
No, it was never defined.
Oh.
It was never defined in statute. But now, since you're adding a new category that could potentially be confused by some between an ESTA and reserve forest land, it was thought to have the definitions to provide some clarity that they are different categories of enrollment. So then you get the definition of reserve forest land, means land that is managed for the purpose of attaining old forest values and functions in accordance with minimum acceptable standards for forest management as approved by the commission. So it's not within that managed forest land parcel, it is the land itself that's managed for that old forest value and function. And that's really it. There are a couple of conforming, that's really it for the statutory changes, except for a couple of conforming changes to build in reference to reserve forest land as on page 9 And then again, on page 10, just referencing reserve forest land. Like, you don't really need to make significant statutory changes because the change that's made to the definition of managed forest land is how you enroll in use value. All of the requirements that apply to managed forest land are going to apply to reserve forest land, the application dates and having a plan, and updating your plan, and having inspections. All that still applies to your land because it's managed forest land. You're just a different category of managed forest land. But then you come to page 3. This is the requirement that on or before December 31, 2022, but end of this year, the Commissioner of Forests and Parks reports to the General Assembly regarding the enrollment of reserve forest land in use value. The report shall include the standards for management of reserve forest land eligible for participation in use value. Remember, that's how you get eligible. That's what the definition says. Reserve forest land that meets the commissioner's minimum standards. So you're going to see what those minimum standards are going to be when they come back to you in December. They shall be the same or substantially the same as the standards set forth in this report. So as the commissioner proposed in the report from October, the standards are going to be similar. There's obviously some details the commissioner is going to have to work out. And so it's not exactly the same, substantially the same. And then there's going to be a summary of how a property owner of land already enrolled in use value as productive forest land would enroll land as reserve forest land, and vice versa, how a property owner of land enrolled in use value program as a reserve forest land would transition to enrollment in productive forest. So how do you move between the different categories of managed forest land? That's something you probably will want to understand before the program goes into effect. And
Just a quick question. Do we have an estimate as to how many acres this could preserve?
well, I think
Well,
that's
okay, all right, thank you.
to Keith and the commissioner.
Okay, great.
They set all that out
In that,
here.
thank
They
you.
have a table of like all the different
Great.
ways that you do it.
Okay, thank you.
So they're the ones to talk to you about.
Yep, okay, thanks.
Representative Baumgart's referenced how Ways and Means built into the House Natural Resources Committee's report, an additional report. And that report will be due December 31st, 2024 to you. And it's a report from the Commissioner of Taxes after consultation with Forests and Parks, the Secretary of Agriculture, and the current Use Advisory Board about the strategies and rates for the valuation of all land and enrolled in use value, and recommend whether and how to ensure that the fiscal return to landowners in the state is consistent among use values and uses of the different categories of enrolled land. They really wanted to know, frankly, whether or not the reimbursement rates for all the different types of use value lands should be more similar, if not the same, than they are today. And that really kind of goes to the heart of the program of, is the land value for its actual use? Is its land value because of its enrolled, just because it's enrolled in use value? Should it all land have the same enrollment value? And what that means fiscally to run this program, because it does require money to run the program, and some of that money comes out of the ed fund. So that's part of what they want to look at. It's not as clear as it probably could be in the language, but it's really kind of, hey, should the program be uniform or not? Should the state try to do uniformity or not? And what are the fiscal implications if it did?
So I have a question about, so that report is coming back December 31, 2024.
Yeah.
But the the program to allow reserve force and becomes effective on July 1, 2023.
Right, so that second report, the Ways and Means report for shorthand, is really not about reserve forest land, it's about use value as a whole. And looking at reimbursement rates and the funding of the program as a whole.
Is there anything that's going to predict how much more land might enter UVA and what the cost might be prior to enactment?
Well, that is what Keith and the commissioner did in their report, and they can better answer that. And their kind of estimate of how much they think over time. And then moving on to page 14, there is that implementation, as Representative Baumgart noted. No new legislation needs to be enacted once the commissioner standards come in, unless the General Assembly doesn't like those standards and or wants to change how the program operates. So land reserve forest land can begin to enroll on July 1, 2023. Effectively, there will be 6 months of notice of what the commissioner standards, minimum acceptable standards would be, unless of course you change those through legislation. So according to PBR, that's a pretty good date for them to start enrolling reserve forest land. That won't be a significant onus, administrative onus on them. And then the last section, or last substantive section, is a report. It's basically a status report. On January 15, 2026, the commissioner reports back to you, General Assembly, summary of how enrollment of managed forest land and use value has changed since the passage of the act, including whether owners of managed forest land change status of enrollment to reserve forest land or ESTAs, the number of persons enrolled in UVA as reserve forest land, and any other information the commissioner determines is relevant to the ongoing enrollment of reserve forest land. And the last section is effective dates. The findings, the report from the commissioner on standards and enrollment, the implementation section, and the report on enrollment take effect on passage, but the statutory changes don't take effect until July 1, 2023. And that's when people can start to enroll as reserve forests.
Great, that is very helpful. Any pretty questions for council? Seeing none, are you able to stay?
Yep, I'm saying.
That's Snyder. Okay, so Commissioner Snyder, could you rejoin us at the table? Thank you.
Morning again. For the record, Michael Snyder, Commissioner, Forest, Parks, and Recreation. Along with me, I'd like to introduce Keith Thompson by Zoom. Keith is our Private Lands Program Manager. Also like me, a former county forester implementing the current use program. Also like me, by disclosure, an owner of current use of lands enrolled in the forest land category. Keith is also, by the way, the coiner of the phrase conservation ladder. I want to give attribution to him, which we discussed earlier. Also by way of introduction, as has been mentioned, graciously by Mr. O'Grady, Keith and our team did an enormous amount of work to prepare this report responsive to the committee's request. It has my deep gratitude for an incredibly good job. And I brought Keith along, not just as a window into the amazing professionals at FBR, but because I think he can be helpful, particularly with detailed questions here. So thanks, Keith, for joining us. You've heard an introduction by reporter of the bill in the House and a walkthrough with Ledge Council. How can I help here at this point? You heard it. I think they described it well. This was in response to advocacy last winter for kind of an open category, which we vehemently opposed for many, many reasons, and we shared those reasons reasonably and carefully with the committee. And that led to them asking, well, how could it work? So we worked on that and did an analysis of what's possible. And in general, we began with some real serious constraints. First, do no harm to this really important program, as you've heard. It's the most important and successful conservation program in our state's history. Don't undermine the original and underlying purposes that give privacy to working forests and agricultural lands, but build upon and seek to meet the goals as stated, which would be accelerated attainment of old forests. You can't really get old forests without time, but it turns out you can advance and accelerate the development of old forest functions and values, certain characteristics through adaptive silvicultural practices, etc. So we support those goals. It's very important. We've heard that the agency, through Vermont Conservation Design, has goals, targets for a bunch of different land categories, age classes, if you will, and types of forest, not including old forests, but also young forests. So we support these goals of attainment of old forest characteristics because they really are important and significantly underrepresented on our landscape. There was also stated early on an interest in allowing, and Mr. O'Grady touched on this, right now, you have legally constrained against managing the timber. Say you have a forever wild easement that doesn't allow management, then you're just not eligible for this program. You have to have the rights to control the vegetation to be eligible. So they're not. And they say, well, we've protected this land, we're being taxed at this development rate. Well, we should be able to get into current use. And we pointed out that, well, not by dint of easements, that would not be reasonable for many reasons, including reasons of equity, but also easements would vary and it would be just enormously complicated. So instead, we thought, well, is there a way to reduce barriers for enrollment of such parcels? And that's those three things. First, do no harm, support the primacy of working forests, and then consider ways to meet these goals. And basically what we had landed on was building upon acres that we know exist on our landscape and many parcels that have barriers to management. So ecologically significant treatment areas would be the first among them, but they are by definition in a different category within managed forest land. And that's really where we were saying is let's do this within the managed forest land. We'll create a whole new category. By the way, one of our other sideboards was fiscal restraint. There's foregone revenues, significant foregone revenue to the ed fund through current use to hold harmless payments to towns. Creating an opening in the program that just wide open would have significant fiscal implications that we could not live with. So that was one of the sideboards. Keep it in the managed category. Don't open it all up. Have standards for passive and restorative management. It's not parking, in other words. This needs to be legitimate for the public purposes that we all benefit from. So we looked at that, starting with the Estes, inoperable land with steep slopes, wet places, unproductive soils, and settled on this basic framework that is if you have 30% or more of any given parcel with those existing barriers to management, then that entire parcel would be eligible for this different category within the managed forest land, a subcategory, much like the Estes, where you still have to have a plan by the standards to be created by the commissioner, oversight by our county foresters, public accountability towards these goals. But then you would be in this different place. This is an historic change. I want to be clear about that, and it makes us extremely nervous, even while we support these goals and want to find a way. It's a big historic change, and it's also a very surgical change. So in principle, it's huge, and I ask you to consider that, as we all should. In effect, it's really surgical, and that's by design. So Keith and team did this really great analysis of the landscape and did a GIS, a geographic information system kind of approach of mapping and where are these, and found that there's some 860,000 acres that we think would qualify for these constraints.
Can you say that number again?
Sure, 860,000 acres.
Wow.
And 2/3 of them are already enrolled in the program. And that's why it does not result in the fiscal note, which we'll speak to later, is really modest because most of the land is already enrolled. So there wouldn't be new enrollments, it would be a shift if a landowner chose to enter into this subcategory. The other 1/3 is significant of lands that could come into the program. We don't know what people will do. We expect that some are not in the program because of this, but that some are not in the program for lots of other reasons and they'll never join the program.
Sure.
And so we just have to guess at that, but I want to be clear, there's additional land that could come into the program with those fiscal implications, administrative implications. And that land would now be coming out of productive use, and that is a concern to us. Remember, our first goal was do no harm, maintain the primacy, and so we're trying to strike a balance here, and that's what's done here. I'm being, at the chair's request, I'm being super fast. This is, believe it or not, this is really complicated. There's a lot of people with great interest on all sides. I do encourage you to fit them in so that there's a reasonable conversation here, but I'm trying to be as surgical as I can. The report is dense. It's a fantastic piece of work, frankly.
Really, it's interesting.
So I recommend that, and I'm hoping that sort of covers it here, but to get to your questions, I don't want to give it short shrift, but and so I'm feeling a little tense about trying to meet the goal of being fast, but also being comprehensive and fair.
Well, your report really is, I mean, it's not that long a report, but 30 pages, but there's a lot of information.
It really is.
Yeah. So
I shared with Jude, your committee assistant, a short set of slides, 8 or 10 slides that really are intended to summarize that 30-page report into like 8 or 10 slides. I'd be happy to walk through them with you real quick now if it's of interest. You have it. How would you like to proceed from here? Again, I'm feeling a little nervous about I don't want to give this short shrift, but I understand where you're at.
so we're scheduled to switch topics in 5 minutes. Why don't we just do 15 minutes? Just go through the slides briefly, so we'll see them, and then we can come back to them.
Sure. Jude, could I ask for your help in presenting those?
Yes.
In the meantime, ask a quick question.
Yeah.
So again, the potential in terms of new acres.
860,000 acres.
Right.
Potentially could be
Potentially.
now in current use.
Yeah,
With a wider range of options,
Okay.
including passive management,
yeah,
which is a significant change. Still need follow standards.
Right.
We anticipate that that's not nothing. That is protecting from erosion. That's dealing with invasives.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
adaptive silviculture. It could include managing for timber, as long as
Okay.
you're moving towards old conditions and belt functions and values. So it's not a prohibition, it's
Okay.
a choice, but it creates new options for less timber management, to be clear, on 860,000 acres. 2/3 of them already in the program,
Yeah.
in current use, that is. So not this wave of new enrollments,
right.
but potential
Right.
shifts
Right.
within the
Shifts
program
within.
in the
Okay.
subcategory.
Thank you.
And if every single person who would become eligible
Yeah.
because of their land enrolled, that's 286,000 additional acres. So
Correct.
That's incredible.
we won't get there. Senator Weston.
How did they choose 20 acres? 20 acres is,
You mean the original that,
how did we land at 20 acres? 20 acres is a pretty small piece. Quite frankly, I look at a lot of the 25-acre pieces that are in the current use program now, and what it's become is a park for people with houses.
understood?
And if now I'm gonna have somebody that has 27 acres in a house and they're gonna do 5 acres of I don't have to touch it, that's perfect for a park.
Right, but they have to qualify and they have to. meet standards.
I understand that, but when I look at this, I would think what we would be more interested in is protecting large tracts.
Indeed, and there,
And
no argument.
And I would think that when we get a larger tract, that would be where we might want to concentrate to get the bang in this to produce that.
I follow.
So I kind of look at the 20 acres and say, unless there's something extremely unusual or natural on a piece, 25 is a pretty small number.
I do not disagree. We've had this conversation for a long time about the minimum acreage. And just to be clear, Senator Weston's referencing is not in this bill. It's pre-existing in statute that there's a requirement for a minimum of 25 contiguous acres, exclusive of any house site, which you need to exclude 2 acres for every home site. And we just have this backstop of 20 acres, minimum of 20 in productive use. So, and that was established as kind of a backstop when the ESCAs came on in the mid 2000s, late 2000s. As like, well, you can enroll into this category, the subcategory of ESCAs, but you still have to have the backstop of some minimum acreage of active work. So that's what he's referencing, and we're just building, it's there.
Well, I would say if I'm going to give the break in the taxes, and I am going to look at where is the pieces of land that we want to protect the most, why would you say it would be a block of 20 acres? I would think a block of, pick a number, but where's the sweet point in this? What I see is developments going in that are 27 acres and whole roads, and for me to create an ESTA in that is kind of, for me, useless.
And it may be. Meaning they have to qualify, right? That it's not you don't get to just choose an ESTA. You have to have the conditions on the ground. Frankly, our conditions are really, they're strict. And accordingly, there haven't been a lot of takers. It's surprising because you have to meet, it has to be a vernal pool with breeding habitat for amphibians, not just a wet park. So not everybody gets to have an ESTA. Just as background.
So I hear that, but when I drive home and I drive up Route 12 and I get the big long stretch between Elmore and Worcester, and I see that, I can totally understand where we might want to have a big piece that is a couple hundred acres that would create, and this category would work. I don't want it. When I get those little broken up lots, it doesn't seem as valuable to me. So I'm just trying to figure that out.
I understand, and I appreciate it. I think it is a bigger conversation about current use in general, about minimum acreage, which we talked about. That just to be clear, Senator Weston's onto something. We have increasing numbers of parcels in current use of enrollments and increasing acres, but they're not the same. The rate of increasing parcels outstrips the rate of acres. That's because you can have 100 acres, one parcel in, you subdivide it into 425s, they're all still qualifying. Now you have 4 parcels, but still the same 100 acres. He's right. That's something to look at. It's just not contemplated here. We're working from existing statute. Shall I proceed with a quick run through?
No, actually, we're gonna have to.
Well, you told me that we weren't gonna do that, so I just told you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I meant we're not gonna do this slideshow. We have to go on to the next bill.
You have the slides. They actually boil it down. And I think it's intended to answer a lot of the basic questions of how this works, and what is it?
We're not done, but it's, we're slated to finish as a morning committee a week from this Friday, so we have to be.
Well, take a good close look, ask your questions, let us know if you need further, and again, I do hope you'll hear from others with interest.
You told me we weren't gonna get to it.
Yeah, I meant we weren't gonna be able to get to the slideshow now.
If I could, Mr. Chair, just because Keith has taken the time, he's worked hard on this, we would offer, is there anything that Keith would like to add or correct me on, for example? Could we give Keith that chance? Anything,
Sure.
Keith? Thank you.
Everyone needs a guardian angel.
I apologize. I don't see everybody in the room. Thank you. I think in regards to what are the value of having small parcels included in this, one of the sayings we have in FPR is that small parcels are a big deal. In many respects, they're the glue that hold the big chunks of forest together. And there are some portions of our landscape that are highly fragmented, and that exclusion of smaller parcels from the strategies that we need to use to protect our forests may eliminate some significant portions of our landscape from being part of those efforts. And looking at Chittenden County, looking at portions of Orange, Windham, Windsor counties, and so on, Many of those larger blocks of forest are made up to a large degree by smaller parcels. And larger parcels are hugely important, and they make sense to be the priority, but doing it to the exclusion of considering the smaller parcels could have unintended consequences.
Thanks, Keith. Appreciate that. And thanks for giving Keith the chance.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Mr.
All right.
Thompson.
Thanks for coming in,
Yeah.
and we will take up the bill again, but for now, we wanted to have
You're still
a chance to, yes, thank you, get it launched, so.
Thank you all.
Thank
Bill, sort of an enhanced bill of production, that's really all we're after this morning. Thanks again. So, from the
It's funny, they were all just, waiting out there. I'm sure when G went out there and told them. I'm sure, no, I know, I'm sure they panicked. I wish I'd seen their faces
Come on in.
Is it okay to come in?
Yes.
for a few minutes.
Mr. Chair, can I ask a question?
Sure.
I just spoke with.
We are still live.
Yes, we are still live.
Just spoke with.
I learned my lesson this morning. I'm gonna sit away from the door.
Yes.
I was just saying, I sat behind the door this morning. I don't recommend.
It's in the mic.
Yeah.
Keep ourselves out of the room.
Okay.
Okay. So we are returning the Mr. Coda, he's supposed to, I think. Thank you very much. So the committee is returning to Bill H715 and activating the clean heat standard. Happily, interested parties have been working with the committee and working together outside of the committee in order to keep the bill moving forward. And so there's been quite a lot of editing that includes agreement. And I would like to start with Mr. Duval giving, well, let me, with Mr. Duval sharing the new information that's come out of the ongoing conversation outside the committee room. So we'll see sort of the emerging consensus. Consensus amongst those who are participating. Thank you, Mr. Coden.
Thank you, Chair Bray, members of the committee. I have handouts ready that summarize the suggested revisions. For the record, my name is Jared Duval. I am with you today in my role as a member of the Vermont Climate Council, appointed to the council by the Senate to provide expertise related to energy and data analysis. Like before, I am testifying on behalf of an informal working group that, while representing diverse perspectives and interests, all share a common commitment to Vermont meeting our Global Warming Solutions Act requirements and seeing the Vermont Climate Action Plan succeed. This working group has included multiple Climate Council members, multiple environmental organizations, members of the Clean Heat Working Group, members of the administration, and obligated party perspectives. While I do not presume to speak for the administration, our working group has benefited greatly from collaboration with members of the administration on this latest round of suggested edits, incorporating many of their suggestions from the Monday proposed edits that you saw from the Agency of Natural Resources. Out of our careful work together, I would like to offer, it depends how you count, 6 consensus suggestions from our informal working group. From our perspective,
comment before. Okay, these are consensus among this particular subset of the climate council. This is not the climate council.
This is not the full climate council. This is the folks who have been participating in this working group.
Okay. Are there people on the climate council who were not included in this group?
Yes, but I will reiterate that the clean heat standard was a major recommendation in the climate action plan that was adopted by the Climate Council on December 1st.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you just remind us who got to this point? Who, following up on Senator McCormick's question, who is in the room for this?
Yeah, so I would let individual organizations and individuals speak for themselves, and there has been some variation in composition over time.
Okay.
But the broad perspectives represented have been multiple climate council members, multiple statewide environmental organizations, members of the Clean Heat Working Group that drafted the first design paper, and we've had the perspectives of obligated parties. So
the administration, this is not.
And members of the administration.
Okay, thank you.
That's new to these round of edits.
Okay.
The first round, we did not have, so these are additional, including feedback and engagement with administration perspective.
Yeah. Just for sort of rounding out the perspective, committee, we all received an email this morning from Jennifer Byrne. And so there are other perspectives represented in that email. I would encourage everyone, it's posted to our website as testimony. I encourage everyone in the committee to read it. Mr. Code raised his hand as we were talking about equitable consensus to say that he, I guess as a representative of the Mount Two-Wheelers Association, wasn't part of that working group or whatever. So anyway, all that said, this is what we have for us to work with. So
the last thing I would offer before diving in is that also from our perspective, I do not believe that there are any further or outstanding issues that we are discussing at this point, or that we would expect to find consensus on. So while individual members of the working group may wish to bring forward additional things, these are the things that we were able to find consensus on. Okay. So starting in section 1 of the bill, subsection 8123 relating to clean heat standard compliance. The first thing is a suggestion on sub 2 to make clear, so that the line reads, a substantial portion, this is how the existing text from the 2.1 version reads, a substantial portion of clean heat credits retired by each obligated party shall be secured from clean heat measures delivered to low income and moderate income customers. We are suggesting an addition there, comma, with an emphasis on clean heat measures that reduce the cost of energy for these customers, really to underline the desire from an equity perspective to prioritize measures that save on costs over time. The next would be anything there? Or okay to move on. Next would be on sub 5, further down that page. And this is, so it sets a minimum percentage up above in 2 of the credits that need to be serving low and moderate income Vermonters. So this is just further clarification in determining whether to exceed the minimum percentages of clean heat measures that must be delivered to low and moderate income customers pursuant to 30 VSA 8123, should say D2, it may say DD, it should say D2. The commission shall take into account uptake of other government sponsored. We're recommending striking the language that had previously ended that sentence in version 2.1 and changing it to other government-sponsored low and moderate income weatherization programs. There was a concern with the previous language that if it was about low-income energy subsidies, there could be a confusion with programs like LIHEAP, the low-income heating assistance program, and that was not what the intention was when that was originally proposed. And the addition of low and moderate income parallels the earlier language in this section. So that is that suggestion. The next is still in section 1, but now moving to 8124. This is the subsection on tradable clean heat credits. This is a slight revision of a proposal that we had made in the last round of edits I suggested, but that did not show up in the 2.1 version. And so let me just read the suggested language that would appear in B. So B starts off, this is what already exists. Clean heat credits shall be based on the life cycle CO2e emission reductions that result from the delivery of eligible clean heat measures to end-use customer locations in or into Vermont. We are suggesting the addition of language here. The next sentence, for clean heat measures that are installed, the value of the clean heat credits in each year shall be the life cycle CO2e emission of the heating fuel whose use is avoided by the installation of the measure, minus the life cycle CO2e emissions of the energy that would be used instead in each year. I think the reason that we felt this is important is this is a desire for more clarity in terms of how to address assessing emissions reductions related to installed measures. So if we look at comparison policy like in the low carbon fuel standards out west, it's a pretty straight comparison of life cycle emissions of biofuel X versus fossil fuel Y. But for an installed measure that exists over multiple years and that may not be a fuel, it may be weatherization that's avoiding the use of fuel. We just wanted to provide some additional clarity and intent around how to address those types of measures. It does not tie the PUC's hands on the other question that was being discussed about whether or how much to bring forward future credit values. It's just trying to provide additional clarity about how installed measures should be approached in terms of calculations.
So we're measuring apples and apples.
Exactly.
Okay. As opposed to being maybe doing apples and apples, but now. Thank you.
The next is still in section 181.24, but moving on to sub 2. So this was a suggestion that the administration added, or it was in their Monday proposed revisions. And we agree with that and think it should be added in. So this would be an addition of a sub 2 after sub 1 saying the commission shall determine whether a requirement that a certain portion of clean heat credits in each compliance year be acquired from weatherization projects should be imposed in order to further the state's building efficiency goals. So this is not prescriptive, but it is saying, please look at this because that is an important goal in state policy to ensure that we're continuing to advance weatherization efforts.
So I'm just trying to make sure I'm seeing where it inserts. Is this in G?
Yes, thank you. It would be a G2. That's what I meant to say after G1. Okay. There is a further suggestion right below that. This was the starting point for this was language in the ANR language from Monday, but it has been further revised. So this would be right after that G2 suggested addition of G3. It's long, so please bear with me. I'll try to read it quickly but clearly. The commission shall consider and where practicable, implement mechanisms that would promote the delivery of clean heat measures that provide greenhouse gas emissions reductions over multiple years, but have upfront capital costs to end-use customers. Particular focus should be on the delivery of weatherization measures to low and moderate income customers. Where additional legislative authority is required, the commission shall recommend to the legislature additional actions to promote delivery of such measures. Nothing in this subsection shall limit the responsibility of the commission to achieve the requirements of the thermal sector portion of the emission reduction requirements of 10 VSA 578A and subsections 8123A and D of this chapter. In implementing this subsection, the commission shall not take actions that create undue adverse financial impacts. So this is with the recognition that there are some measures that durably reduce emissions over time, 10, 15, 20, 25 years, wanting to make sure that they do not get that they are able to qualify for clean heat credits on an equal playing field with measures that are only for a length of 1 year. That we feel that there is a benefit to the state in terms of greater assurance of meeting our emissions reduction goals to the extent we can promote measures that will give us durable emissions reductions over time and lower heating costs over time. And we want to make sure that attention is given to those. So again, this is not prescriptive, but it says that the commission shall consider and where practicable work to make sure that those mechanisms of durable emissions reductions from installed measures are able to move forward.
I have a quick question for council on this, and that is the cross-reference to in this subsection, so the very last sentence, in implementing this subsection, the commission shall not take actions that create undue adverse financial impacts. How extensive is that reference subsection? Is it all of 8124, or how far does that extend?
So subsection is the, Alan Zakowski, subsection is the letter level.
Okay.
So that would probably be subsection G in this
Yeah.
case.
Okay.
Subdivision is the number level. So you may want to consider what you may want to consider that.
Okay, I just wanted to double check how far that extends. Okay, thank you. I'm gonna fly it on my copy. Thanks.
And so two more. The remaining suggestions are in section 3. This is the section dealing with Public Utility Commission implementation. And it is in, I don't know the correct way to refer to this, I guess. Oh, it's lowercase I. So after H of funding, there is I checkback reports. And this, again, the starting point was the suggested edits received from the Agency of Natural Resources on Monday, but there were further edits made to this. This is the overall, before I read it, and I don't know if I need to read the whole thing since everybody has it in front of them, and I don't want to run short on time or eat into others' time. Let me just try to state the intent of these edits. And it is to ensure two things. One, that we take a comprehensive approach to economic analysis, looking at both costs and savings, both in the near term and in the long term, both for fossil fuel customers and folks who are switching off of fossil fuel. So wanting to make sure we're having a comprehensive approach to how that economic analysis is done, and that it builds on decisions that have been made and work that has been done by the Climate Council, including adopting a social cost of carbon for Vermont, and also including economic analysis that was conducted for our pathways analysis report that already assesses effects in terms of savings and costs of different pathways and of potential impacts on the state economy. So we wanted to make sure that those were referenced as starting points as well.
Okay. So in another way, is it another way of saying that, to say that the cost of business as usual should be considered, as well as the cost of the changes contemplated?
Yes, I think that is fair. I think it was also a desire to look at the net impact on total spending in terms of, this isn't in the language, but colloquially, we were interested in what is the net effect on Vermont's total heating bill. So as one of the lenses of analysis, not solely, but one of the lenses of analysis. I should also note that at the end of this, the language had originally said modeling should estimate a range of high, medium, and low for on prices and on greenhouse gas emissions reduction impacts. We're suggesting taking out assessing a range of impacts on greenhouse gas reductions, because upfront, the very purpose of this bill is to achieve clarity that we will achieve at least the 40% reductions from the thermal sector. So the range of high, medium, and low impacts is meant to be more on the economic analysis, not on whether we don't want any suggestion that it would be possible or okay to not meet those requirements in line with the Global Warming Solutions Act.
Any questions for Mr. Duval?
Comment. This seems like a very solid compromise. It sounds like the administration was involved. This gets us to the finish line. This seems like a great step. So appreciate everybody being involved. Thank you.
And then it's okay, just one more. So on that continues. Sorry, and then the last piece is that there was a suggestion that again in the ANR proposed edits for Monday to add a subsection 2, was that in version
I'm sorry, where
2.1?
are you now?
This is the last part of section 3 before it goes to section 4. It was a sub.
oh, okay.
2. Was that already in 2.1 upon receiving?
Yes.
Okay, so, and I should just say
It
that,
had been, and what was a little tricky is the Monday edits from A&R, it was up front, it was on like page 2 or 3, and
Okay.
the bill got restructured and it got moved back here.
I'll just say that from the working group, there was support for that sub 2 language there.
Thank you all. Yeah.
There was something in conversation just now that I'm not seeing on the page.
What's because that was my mistake. I'm sorry, Senator. It wasn't an actual change from the version 2.1 that you were working from.
Yeah, no, but there was some talk about the idea of taking into account, comparing the costs of this action with what would have been the cost of not taking the action, of business as usual. And someone read it that way. I think the chair did not. I don't see that on the page.
So there is language, and it's hard to say because we don't have line numbers, but it talks about after saying that the analysis should take into account the economic modeling conducted in the Vermont Pathways Analysis Report that was done for the council. It then goes on to say, and the potential cost of delaying action to achieve the
I
requirements.
missed that. Where is that? I'm sorry. Okay, I hadn't gotten that. Thank you. Thank you.
I mean, I think the other thing I was alluding to is social cost of carbon. So it acknowledges, quantifies the basically value of the emissions of the current system.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. With that, I'd like to invite Secretary Moore back to the table.
Would it be possible to have Ed McNamara join us in the room? I know you have the
It's
tag
always-
hanging on your door.
We're always flexible.
Even in a pen.
Thank you.
Excuse
Okay.
Problem fixed itself.
Problem fixed.
We're going to our stretch code here.
We should make that.
We really are getting musical chairs now.
Oh, that's true.
Be like pre-pandemic times.
Thank you.
So, thank you for coming back. Thank you
Yes.
for working with the other
Yes.
folks to help keep edits moving forward. And I guess we want to check in with you and see, I know that the discussions are ongoing, so I don't know if these discussions represent all your concerns at this point, or if there's anything else you want to share with the committee.
Yes, so good morning again, Julie Moore, Secretary of Natural Resources, and I'm very appreciative for the summary Jared put together and the cooperative spirit folks have engaged in these conversations over the last several days. There are two remaining areas of disagreement where we haven't been able to reach a consensus approach. And so wanted to flag those for you, but first offer support for the language Jared presented as being truly a consensus agreement, and hope that is of help to the committee as you complete your work on this bill. The two outstanding items, one relates to concerns we have raised on several occasions around double counting credits under the Clean Heat Standard in Tier 3. This is section 8123D2. We had proposed to strike some language that I believe remains in the draft bill and remains a concern to us. And to the extent there are questions, would encourage them to be directed to Ed and TJ, who are certainly better positioned to speak to the technical details, but this remains an area of concern for the administration.
Can you, sorry, give me that that citation again, 8123
D2.
D, G is in David 2. Okay.
When you're ready, Mr. Chair.
Yes, please, go ahead.
So can you just say more about the double counting piece? Are you concerned that double counting would be happening under the bill?
Correct.
Okay, may I, Mr. Chair,
Yes, please.
follow up with Ledge Council?
Yes.
Because I feel like we're in a moment of almost, can you say something about that concern for us? Because I know we had you in the chair at one point, we didn't see it as a concern. You're representing us in our work. Would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure, so, Ellen Tchaikovsky, Office of Legislative Counsel, double counting here has been used in two different ways. The bill ensures that credits that have been generated are only counted once for purposes under the clean heat standard. I think the concern that you just heard though is different in that it's trying to avoid having things that count for other different programs that don't use clean heat credits count for that program also. So that is a different type of double counting.
Can you say something more about that? Just
She's accurately clarified the concern. It's not within the clean heat standard. It's between different programs. And I don't know, Ed, if you'd like to add that too.
Yeah, Ed McNamara, General Counsel for A&R. There's a concern about double counting, then there's also sort of transfer payments as well. There's sort of additive payments of, if, for example, tier 3 measure was created, does an obligated entity then have to purchase that tier 3 credit from a Vermont distribution electric utility, even though it was Vermonters' funds that basically paid for that tier 3 credit? So Vermonters over here paying for credits. It's, at the end of the day, from a societal perspective, it's probably a wash, but it ends up with additional, it's essentially transfer costs. I think the term I used before is, if you go to a concert and you see a convenience fee, it's essentially like that. Why do we need it in the first place? Especially given that there are likely to be ways that PUC can consider to think about, here's tier 3 over here, here's the remaining CHS obligations over here. We're all trying to get to the thermal GHG emissions reductions. So there are different ways to achieve it, and simply letting the PUC hear in a very transparent, open process, different thoughts and ideas and how best to address them.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Ellen.
Secretary Moore, you want to?
Yes, sorry.
Oh, no, that was an excellent place to pause. The other outstanding concern for the administration remains the check back that is currently in section 3, subpart I. Commissioner Tierney sent a very clear, I hope, letter this morning highlighting many of the same concerns in this space. But the idea that we are venturing into largely uncharted territory with a clean heat standard without any depth of knowledge about the likely costs, and that it will be important not only for the PUC to undertake that technical work, but for an opportunity for further discussion within the General Assembly once we have the information specific to the clean heat standard to put on the table. And so are asking that there be a vote by the General Assembly on the Commission's recommendations regarding cost containment, and that the PUC would stop work absent such a vote.
Okay. And so if I'm looking at our last draft, the 2-1 draft, and page 25, top of the page, sub 2. So the current language reads, upon receiving the recommendations regarding cost containment mechanisms provided by the Commission, the General Assembly shall determine whether to enact legislation adopting the Commission's recommendations. I spoke earlier with the Secretary about that language, and so not that we're rewriting it permanently, but just as a suggestion, I think it could be rewritten as the General Assembly shall vote on the Commission's recommendations. And that is more, whatever, clear, the mechanics are more clear. And I think what what's unclear for me is sort of how does that fit into the roles and relationships between this legislature and a future legislature, and to what degree can we encumber them to take an action in a statute passed this year? So acknowledging it, we don't have much time to get into it very far. Council, can you say anything about that? Requiring a vote in a bill, how often we do this or don't do this, and what, so the next legislature, in essence, say, that was fine for you to say last year, but you can't encumber us to do that. We're not following that statutory direction.
So I'm only aware of one similar example, which I think you've all discussed before, the Vermont Yankee issue about the future of nuclear facilities in the state. I will say you also have considered the floor amendment that was offered in the House and voted down, which contains the language I think that was just proposed. In drafting that language, I structured it to be constitutional, as a constitutional option that the legislature would have. And so instead of binding a future legislature, that language read, the PUC's work must stop and cannot start again until the legislature has passed a bill endorsing or affirming the PUC's work. So the legislature isn't bound there to do anything unless they want the PUC to keep working. However, the PUC is bound to do what the legislature has told them to do. So to stop work or to continue.
Well, that's helpful. I mean, it makes it clear why it works. The problem is, I think, practically speaking, through when we already have an intense, complex development process underway, to pause it for 5 months, because I can't imagine the legislature proceeding much more quickly than that. Seems like it would be very problematic to the program, but it's good to understand the legal lay of the land. Do you have anything else?
I would also add one other thing. In this last draft, you did change from an order to a rulemaking process, which involves the legislative check-in of LCAR endorsing the rules as complying with the legislature's intent. That is an additional element you added in the last draft.
I think so. We talked about this a little, part of the offline, keep working. It was my impression that although we would be binding ourselves to a review at LCAR, and that I don't think any commission would move forward without approval because of the likelihood of suit and being the burden party in any suit, that the governor's office felt that that was an insufficient measure for legislative action. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
So, Mr. Chair, one of the ways for what's proposed here to keep pulling ahead is to grant the PUC the authority to order it to happen. And with the removal of the provision that allows them to do that by order, that is that prohibits them from doing it without being checked.
Well, right. So there's a little bit of irony by switching to rules. We're actually trying to make it a more regimented and public process with another level of affirmation, as in the intent as expressed here, including cost containment measures, I think would end up as an expression of our intent. When it may be binding on LCAR to disapprove the rule, that it would provide a mechanism, but we'll have to work on that linkage between legislative action and moving the rule forward. Mr. McNamara.
If I can just note the important distinction between the LCAR provision and an affirmative vote, a vote that must happen rather than affirmative, is that LCAR represents essentially acquiescence to an action as opposed to an affirmative statement that, yes, we believe this needs to move forward. In other words, LCAR could just simply sit there and say absolutely nothing except for looks good, approve. And that is a small select number of legislators, not the entire legislative body. So I think the two concerns are acquiescence versus affirmative granting of authority to continue forward. And then the other is it's essentially the legislature delegating to a very small number of legislators a very important policy issue. So I do not see the LCAR as a substitute for a vote. I understand that there's a legislative check-in. I think it's a vastly different check-in process.
Well, I think a little bit about LCAR without wanting to get into it. We actually do take an affirmative action. We approve, and if we don't, then that's the non-action. So approval of a rule, in this case, I think would be absolutely essential for it to move forward. The other thing is, although there are 8 members of LCAR, they're drawn from around the building, and every single committee of jurisdiction that's implicated also has the opportunity to weigh in to the process. So it's bigger than the 8. It's each committee of jurisdiction for the rule under consideration that has the chair on behalf of the committee sends a letter having reviewed the rule on behalf of the committee. And sometimes the committee itself actually can send on the discussion. But
it's either way, there's a delegation to a small group. The commission is a small group too. The PUC is a small group.
I mean, I think it's the way we get a lot of business done. But,
Yeah.
Everyone should be part of everything. Okay.
At least with LCAR, the delegation is keeping it in the family.
So I have I have about 5 versions of this stuff. The Monday version has your original language. Now I just wanted to go back to that. And so the language there says that all eligible food measures that are delivered in Vermont shall be accounted for in the commission's design of the program. The commission shall decide whether emissions reductions resulting from programs delivered under the energy efficiency program for Chip 3 should be eligible for clean heat credits. So I'd say the distinction between that and what Mr. Duval has shared with us this morning is that it pushes it back to a PUC decision as opposed to declaring it to be eligible for credits under. Although I understand there's a difference between the clean heat credit earned for one, it's only usable in the clean heat program. The recs that are be created by the same measure could be brought into the utilities obligation. I mean, I said that right. I don't know. The recs are generated by the action, or it's just it's their greenhouse gas reduction target. So sorry, misspoke. Okay, so that's very helpful. We're down to 2 places where the ship is still running aground. Maybe we throw ballast over and get it floating. I don't know. So we'll work on edits. Anything that anyone wants, Mr. Porter, you raised your hand earlier. Did you want to share something with the group while we're still here?
Sure. What is to say, you can't sell the same wood twice. I can sell a pellet stove, I can get credit for it under clean heat, and then I can sell it in partnership with GMP so they can meet their territory obligations. Second is enforcement. Say it again, and again. If we do not empower the DOT to stop midnight oil from crossing the border, we will have widespread fraud in this program. Gotta get the DOT to power.
Okay. So has the administration looked into that enforcement issue?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. Right. But we're not in the finish line here, so Senator McCormick.
Yeah, is this proposed language in the public record?
I believe so.
Yeah.
Interested parties have, okay, good.
It's posted. Okay, so I appreciate everyone working, turning around edits on a very timely basis. I'm gonna talk with, I think the committee needs to decide, make some decisions on its own, and then we'll reach out to parties and see about any kind of, further edits on language. If the administration could look into the enforcement issue, that seems like we would want to make compliance the foundational piece of the program so that scofflaws don't undermine it.
Yes.
Okay. All right, so again, thank you, everyone,